When Rebecca Mitchell handed me that $10,000 fine for my ranch's fence posts being 3 inches too tall, she smirked and said, "My kind didn't belong in civilized neighborhoods anyway," standing there in her pristine white pantsuit with her clipboard held like a weapon. She had no idea she'd just declared war on the wrong rancher. "I'm Mason Caldwell, and my family has worked this land since 1892. But what happened next would teach this HOA president that some battles are won, not with money or lawyers, but with 100-year-old cattle laws she never knew existed. The trouble started on a humid Thursday morning in late September when I was replacing rotted fence posts along the eastern border of my property. The old cedar had finally given way after 30 years of Texas weather, and I'd spent the better part of a week hauling in new posts and stringing fresh wire. My 16-year-old son Tyler was helping me, learning the same skills my grandfather had taught my father, and my father had taught me. We were setting the corner post when I heard the unmistakable sound of an expensive car crunching over our gravel drive. I turned to see a white Mercedes SUV parking precisely parallel to our fence line, like the driver was afraid even her tires might catch something from our working ranch. Out stepped a woman who looked like she'd walked straight out of a country club catalog. Her white pantsuit was spotless, despite the dusty conditions. Her auburn hair was styled in one of those complicated arrangements that probably cost more than our monthly feed bill, and she carried herself with the kind of rigid posture that suggested she'd never done a day of physical labor in her life. Rebecca Mitchell approached us with measured steps, her designer heels somehow navigating the uneven ground without stumbling. She was clutching a leather portfolio and wearing sunglasses that probably cost more than most people's mortgage payments. Everything about her screamed money and privilege, from the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist to the way she wrinkled her nose at the smell of fresh earth and honest sweat. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone of someone used to being obeyed immediately. "I need to speak with the property owner about these fence violations." She said the word violations, like she was pronouncing a death sentence. I straightened up from where I'd been checking the post level and walked over, Tyler trailing behind me curiously. "That would be me." "Ma'am, Mason Caldwell." I extended my hand out of habit. Though I could tell by her expression she had no intention of shaking it, she looked at my work-roughened hand like it might be contaminated, then made a show of consulting her portfolio instead. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm Rebecca Mitchell, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association." She paused, clearly expecting the title to inspire some kind of reverence or fear. "We need to discuss your blatant disregard for community standards." I felt Tyler tense beside me, but I put a calming hand on his shoulder. "Community standards? Ma'am, this ranch has been here since before your grandparents were born. We're not part of any HOA." Rebecca's perfectly painted lips curved into what might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth. "That's where you're wrong. Mr. Caldwell, when Willowbrook Estates was developed 5 years ago, the charter included provisions for maintaining aesthetic standards within a 1-mile radius of our community boundaries. Your property falls within that jurisdiction." She pulled out a stack of papers from her portfolio and began reading in a voice that suggested she'd rehearsed this speech. "Your fence posts exceed the maximum height of 6 feet by 3.2 inches. The style is inconsistent with approved architectural guidelines, and the materials used are not from our list of sanctioned suppliers." She looked up from her papers, and I caught a glimpse of something cold and calculating in her green eyes. "The total fine for these violations is $10,000. Due within 30 days. I couldn't help it. I laughed, not a polite chuckle, but a full-bodied laugh that echoed across the pasture. Tyler joined in, though his was more nervous than amused. "Ma'am, you can't be serious. This is agricultural land. We're not subject to your HOA rules, regardless of what your charter says." Rebecca's face flushed beneath her carefully applied makeup. "Mr. Caldwell, I don't think you understand the severity of your situation." Her voice had taken on a harder edge, all pretense of professional courtesy abandoned. "Your kind might be used to doing whatever you please out here in the sticks. But things have changed. Civilized people live in this area now, and we have standards to maintain." The way she said "your kind" made it crystal clear what she thought of ranchers, farmers, and anyone else who worked with their hands for a living. I felt my jaw clench, but I kept my voice level. My kind? You mean the kind that's been paying taxes on this land for over a century? The kind that was here when your civilized neighborhood was nothing but empty prairie? She took a step back, apparently not used to being challenged. Regardless of your history, she said, making the words sound like something distasteful. You're required to comply with current regulations. The fine stands, and if it's not paid within 30 days, we'll be forced to place a lien on your property. Tyler couldn't hold back any longer. You can't do that. This is our home. We've lived here my whole life. Dad built this fence himself when I was a baby. Rebecca turned her cold gaze on my son, and something in her expression made my protective instincts flare. Young man, perhaps if your father had consulted proper authorities before building, we wouldn't be having this conversation. She looked him up and down with obvious disdain, though I suppose attention to detail and following rules aren't exactly priorities in your education. That was the moment I knew this wasn't really about fence heights or architectural guidelines. This was about someone who thought her money and position gave her the right to push around people she considered beneath her. She'd picked the wrong family to mess with. Mrs. Mitchell, I said, my voice dropping to that quiet tone my son recognized as dangerous. I think it's time for you to leave my property. We'll be in touch about this alleged fine through proper legal channels. She clutched her portfolio tighter, and I noticed her knuckles turning white. This isn't over. Mr. Caldwell, the HOA has significant legal resources at its disposal. She glanced around our property with obvious disgust, taking in the working barn, the cattle pens, and the modest farmhouse that had sheltered 4 generations of Caldwells. Perhaps it's time you considered selling? I'm sure the land could be put to better use than this. With that parting shot, she turned on her expensive heels and marched back to her Mercedes. As she drove away, leaving a cloud of dust in her wake, Tyler looked up at me with worried eyes. Dad, can she really fine us $10,000? We don't have that kind of money. I put my arm around his shoulders and watched the Mercedes disappear down the county road. Son, she can try. But what Mrs. Mitchell doesn't know is that Caldwells don't give up without a fight. And we've got a few surprises of our own. That evening, I sat in my grandfather's old study, surrounded by boxes of documents that chronicled our family's history on this land. Birth certificates, death certificates, tax records going back to the 19th century. And most importantly, the original land grants and surveys that established our boundaries long before anyone dreamed of suburban developments and homeowners associations. Tyler helped me sort through the papers, his earlier worry replaced by curiosity about our family's history. I found Mom and Dad's wedding announcement, he said, holding up a yellowed newspaper clipping. And here's a picture of Great-Grandpa Caldwell with his first herd of cattle. I smiled at the faded photograph, remembering the stories my grandfather used to tell about those early days. But I was looking for something specific, something I remembered my father mentioning years ago when developers first started sniffing around our property. Finally, in a leather-bound folder at the bottom of the last box, I found what I was looking for: water rights documentation from 1923, grazing easements that extended well beyond our property lines, and most interestingly, a county ordinance from 1957 that designated our ranch as an agricultural preserve with special protections against encroaching development. Dad, what does open range designation mean? Tyler asked. Reading over my shoulder, I leaned back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. It means, son, that Mrs. Mitchell just opened a door she's going to wish she'd left closed. You see, in Texas, there are still some old laws on the books about livestock and agricultural operations, laws that predate any HOA charter by decades. Tyler's eyes widened as he began to understand. You mean we can? I nodded. If Willowbrook Estates wants to claim jurisdiction over our property, then they need to accept all the responsibilities that come with that, including some very interesting provisions about livestock overflow and grazing rights. Over the next few days, I made several trips to the county courthouse and the agricultural extension office. What I discovered was even better than I'd hoped. Not only was our ranch protected under multiple agricultural preservation statutes, But the old open-range laws meant that if livestock wandered onto adjacent properties due to unclear boundaries or disputed jurisdiction, the landowner was responsible for fencing them out, not the rancher for fencing them in. Even more interesting was what I learned about Willowbrook Estates itself. The development had been built on land that still carried agricultural easements, something the developers had apparently overlooked or ignored. Those easements had never been properly vacated, which meant that technically, the land was still subject to certain agricultural uses. I also did some digging into Rebecca Mitchell's background. She'd moved to the area 3 years ago, after a messy divorce from a tech executive in Austin. She'd bought the largest house in Willowbrook Estates with her settlement money and had immediately set about trying to transform the rural area into her vision of suburban perfection. In her 2 years as HOA president, she'd driven out 3 families with her aggressive enforcement tactics and had filed numerous complaints against every agricultural operation within a 5-mile radius. But Rebecca had made a crucial mistake with the Caldwell Ranch. She'd assumed we were just another family of simple ranchers who could be bullied into submission with legal threats and big fines. She had no idea she was dealing with someone who understood both the old ways and the new laws. A week after her visit, I received the official fine notice in the mail, $10,000 for fence violations, plus an additional $5,000 in administrative fees. The letter was full of legal jargon and threats, clearly designed to intimidate. At the bottom was Rebecca's signature and a handwritten note that said, "I strongly encourage you to consider selling before this becomes more expensive." I set the letter aside and picked up my phone. It was time to call in some favors and put my plan into motion. My first call was to Jim Turner, a cattle rancher from the next county who'd been looking for additional grazing land. "Jim, remember when you asked if I knew of any available pastures? Well, I might have something interesting for you." After explaining the situation, Jim laughed so hard I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "Mason, are you telling me that HOA woman basically invited you to graze cattle in her fancy neighborhood? Oh, this is too good. Count me in." My next call was to Sarah Chen, an agricultural lawyer who specialized in land use disputes. Sarah had helped several ranchers in the area fight off development pressures, and she was familiar with the old laws I'd uncovered. "Mason, this is brilliant," she said after I'd outlined my plan. "If they're claiming jurisdiction over your property for their HOA rules, then they can't selectively ignore the agricultural easements and open range provisions. They've essentially admitted that the properties are legally connected." While Sarah worked on the legal framework, I reached out to other ranchers in the area. Word spreads fast in rural communities, and soon I had commitments from 6 different operations to provide cattle for what we started calling the Willowbrook Grazing Initiative. Tyler was excited about the plan, but also worried about escalation. "Dad, what if Mrs. Mitchell gets really mad? What if she tries to do something worse?" I sat down with him on the front porch, looking out over the land our family had worked for generations. "Son, sometimes standing up for what's right means taking risks. But we're not doing anything illegal or even unethical. We're simply using the same laws she tried to use against us." 2 weeks later, on a beautiful Tuesday morning, the first cattle began arriving. 30 head of mixed-breed cattle, all healthy and well-mannered, delivered right to the boundary between our ranch and Willowbrook Estates. I'd made sure to follow every legal requirement, filing the proper grazing notices and livestock movement permits. Everything was completely above board. I'd also installed several game cameras along the fence line, partly for security but mostly because I wanted to capture Rebecca's reaction when she realized what was happening. I didn't have to wait long. By 10 a.m., I could see her white Mercedes speeding through Willowbrook Estates, stopping at various houses before making a beeline for our property. She parked haphazardly and came storming across the field, her white outfit making her look like an angry swan navigating a pasture. "What is the meaning of this?" she shrieked, gesturing wildly at the cattle that were placidly grazing about 50 feet from her community's perfectly manicured entrance. "You can't just dump a herd of cows next to our neighborhood." I was sitting on my tailgate, enjoying a cup of coffee in the morning sunshine. "Mrs. Mitchell, good morning to you too. Beautiful day for grazing, wouldn't you say?" Her face was turning an alarming shade of red. "This is harassment. This is. This is agricultural terrorism. I'm calling the sheriff right now. I nodded agreeably. That's probably a good idea. I'm sure Sheriff Walker will be interested to hear about the situation. Of course, he's also familiar with the agricultural preservation laws and open range provisions that apply to this area. She pulled out her phone and began stabbing at the screen with perfectly manicured nails. Her hands were shaking with rage, and I noticed she'd forgotten to put on her expensive sunglasses in her rush to confront me. While we waited for the sheriff, Rebecca paced back and forth, alternating between taking pictures of the cattle and making furious phone calls. I caught fragments of her conversations, including several references to emergency HOA meetings and legal action. Sheriff Walker arrived about 20 minutes later, looking like a man who'd rather be anywhere else. He'd grown up in the area and understood the delicate balance between old-timers and newcomers. "Morning, Mason, Mrs. Mitchell," he said, tipping his hat to both of us. "What seems to be the issue here?" Rebecca immediately launched into a tirade about property values, health hazards, and intentional harassment. She waved her arms so dramatically that Sheriff Walker had to step back to avoid being hit. "This man is deliberately trying to destroy our community with these beasts." Sheriff Walker looked at the cattle, who were about as threatening as a field of daisies. Then back at Rebecca. "Ma'am, from what I can see, these cattle are grazing on land that's covered by agricultural easements. Mason's filed all the proper paperwork, and there's no law against livestock in this area. But they're right next to our neighborhood." Rebecca protested. "Children live there. Families. People who paid good money for homes in a livestock-free environment." The sheriff scratched his head, trying to be diplomatic. "Well, ma'am, technically, this has always been livestock country. The developments are what's new, and if your HOA is claiming jurisdiction over the Caldwell Ranch for fence regulations, then the agricultural provisions apply too. Can't have it both ways." Rebecca's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. After the sheriff left and Rebecca retreated to her Mercedes, still sputtering threats about lawsuits and state agencies, I sat back and watched the cattle settling into their new temporary pasture. This was just the beginning of my response to Rebecca Mitchell's war on our way of life. Tyler joined me on the tailgate, grinning from ear to ear. "Dad, did you see her face when Sheriff Walker explained the law? I thought she was going to explode." I ruffled his hair affectionately. "This is an important lesson, son. Sometimes the best response to a bully isn't to fight on their terms, but to change the game entirely." Mrs. Mitchell thought she could use her HOA rules to push us around. Now she's learning that those rules work both ways. As we sat there in the morning sun, watching the cattle graze peacefully within sight of Willowbrook Estate's entrance, I couldn't help but think about all the families who'd been driven away by HOAs and aggressive development. Maybe this would send a message that rural communities wouldn't be bulldozed without a fight. The war was far from over, but the first battle had definitely gone to the Caldwell Ranch. The next morning brought a flurry of activity in Willowbrook Estates that I watched with considerable amusement through my binoculars. Rebecca Mitchell was going door to door with a clipboard, clearly trying to rally support for whatever her next move would be. I could see residents' reactions ranging from sympathy to barely concealed irritation as she gestured wildly toward my property and the peacefully grazing cattle. By noon, she'd organized an emergency HOA meeting in her 3-car garage, which had been converted into what looked like a war room. Through the open doors, I could see charts, maps, and what appeared to be blown-up photographs of my cattle. Tyler and I decided to take a ride along our fence line to check on the herd, making sure we were visible to anyone watching from Willowbrook Estates. "Dad, is that legal?" Tyler asked, pointing to a new sign that had appeared overnight on the HOA's property. It read, "No trespassing livestock will be impounded, violators will be prosecuted," in bold red letters. I chuckled and pulled out my phone to take a picture. "Son, they can put up all the signs they want on their property, but those agricultural easements I showed you mean our cattle have legal right of passage that predates their fancy signs by about 70 years. That afternoon, Sarah Chen called with interesting news. "Mason, I've been doing some deeper research into Willowbrook Estates' incorporation documents. You're not going to believe what I found." It turns out the developers never properly vacated the agricultural easements when they built the subdivision. In fact, they may have intentionally hidden this fact from buyers. This is huge, I said, gripping the phone tighter. You mean all those homeowners bought property without being told about existing agricultural rights? Exactly. And there's more. Rebecca Mitchell was actually informed about these easements when she purchased her home, but she signed a waiver acknowledging them. She's been hoping nobody would ever exercise those rights. I whistled low. So she knew all along that her HOA couldn't really control agricultural activities in the area? Sarah's voice carried a hint of satisfaction. Not only that, but by attempting to fine you and claim HOA jurisdiction, she may have actually strengthened your position. She's essentially admitted that the properties are legally connected, which reinforces the validity of those old easements. After hanging up with Sarah, I decided it was time to expand our operation. I made several more calls, and by evening, I had commitments for an additional 50 head of cattle. If Rebecca wanted to escalate, I was prepared to show her what real escalation looked like. That night, Tyler and I were having dinner when we heard vehicles approaching. Through the kitchen window, I could see a procession of expensive cars parking along our fence line. Rebecca Mitchell emerged from the lead vehicle, followed by what looked like most of the HOA board and several residents. They were carrying flashlights and cameras, obviously intent on documenting something. Stay here, I told Tyler, grabbing my own flashlight and heading outside. As I approached the group, I could hear Rebecca directing people to take pictures from specific angles. Make sure you get the proximity to the Henderson Children's Play set and document any waste material near the property line. We need evidence of health violations. Evening. Folks, I called out, causing several people to jump. Beautiful night for a walk. Isn't it? Rebecca spun around, her flashlight beam hitting me square in the face before she lowered it. Mr. Caldwell, we're conducting an official HOA inspection of potential health and safety hazards. On my property? I asked mildly, because that would be trespassing. A man I recognized as the HOA vice president, Thomas Garrett, stepped forward. We're staying on our side of the property line. Caldwell, just documenting the nuisance you've created. I smiled and pulled out my own phone. Well, as long as we're documenting things, don't mind if I record this inspection. For legal purposes, you understand. Several of the residents looked uncomfortable, and I heard one woman whisper to her husband, maybe we should go. This is getting out of hand. But Rebecca wasn't backing down. Record all you want. Tomorrow morning, Animal Control will be here to remove these cattle as a public health hazard. We've filed complaints with the Health Department, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Zoning Board. I kept my voice calm despite the anger building in my chest. Mrs. Mitchell, those cattle are on land covered by agricultural easements. Any attempt to remove them would be theft of livestock, which is a felony in Texas. We'll see about that. She snapped. Come on, everyone. We have what we need. As the group headed back to their cars, I overheard fragments of conversation that suggested not everyone was on board with Rebecca's crusade. This is getting ridiculous. One man muttered, they're just cows. For heaven's sake. The next morning came with exactly the circus Rebecca had promised. By 8 a.m., vehicles from various county agencies were lined up along the road. Animal Control, Health Department, even someone from the Environmental Agency. I met them at the gate with Sarah Chen, who'd driven out at dawn to be present for the confrontation. The Animal Control officer, a tired-looking man named Pete Simmons, seemed embarrassed to be there. Mason, I've got to respond to the complaint, but between you and me, this is a waste of everyone's time. Those cattle look healthier than most pets, I see. Sarah handed him a thick folder. Here's all the documentation on the agricultural easements. Health certificates for every animal, and the legal framework that protects livestock operations in this area. Pete flipped through the papers, nodding. This is all in order. I'll write up my report. But there's no violation here. One by one, the other agencies reached the same conclusion. The Health Department found no violations. The Environmental Agency noted that the cattle operation was well within acceptable parameters. By noon, They'd all left, leaving Rebecca standing by her Mercedes, looking like someone had just told her Christmas was canceled. But she wasn't done yet. That afternoon, a news van from the local television station pulled up. Rebecca had apparently decided that if she couldn't win through official channels, she'd try the court of public opinion. I watched from my porch as she gave an impassioned interview, gesturing dramatically toward my property. These cattle are destroying our quality of life. Our children can't play outside because of the smell. Our property values are plummeting. This is nothing less than agricultural terrorism. The reporter, a young woman who looked fresh out of journalism school, dutifully recorded Rebecca's complaints, but then she made the mistake of asking for the other side of the story. Well, let's hear from Mr. Caldwell and get his perspective. I walked over, Chula beside me, both of us in our work clothes and covered in the honest dirt of a day's labor. Ma'am, my family's been ranching this land since 1892. We've been good neighbors, paid our taxes, and contributed to this community for over a century. The reporter's eyes lit up with interest. So this is a long-standing ranch operation? Yes. Ma'am, these new developments were built knowing they were in agricultural areas. We've never had complaints until Mrs. Mitchell decided our fence posts were 3 inches too tall and tried to fine us $10,000. The reporter turned back to Rebecca, whose face was flushing red. Is that true? You fined them for fence height? Rebecca stammered, trying to regain control of the narrative. That's not the point. The point is that he's deliberately placed these cattle here to harass our community. Actually, I interjected. The cattle are grazing on land covered by agricultural easements that predate your subdivision by decades. We're simply exercising rights that have existed since before any of these houses were built. The interview continued for several more minutes, but I could tell the story was shifting away from Rebecca's intended narrative of victimhood. When the news aired that night, the segment was titled, Old West Meets New Development, Ranch Family Fights HOA Overreach. Tyler and I watched it together, and he couldn't stop grinning when they showed Rebecca's increasingly flustered responses juxtaposed with shots of the peaceful cattle and our family's long history on the land. The next few days brought unexpected support from across the county. Other ranchers and farmers called to share their own stories of HOA harassment. Several offered to add their cattle to our grazing rotation. Even some Willowbrook residents reached out privately to apologize for Rebecca's behavior and express support for our position. But the real breakthrough came when Martha Williams, one of the original Willowbrook residents and a member of the HOA board, knocked on my door one evening. She was a dignified woman in her 70s who'd moved to the development to be closer to her grandchildren. Mr. Caldwell, I wonder if we might talk, she said, glancing nervously back toward Willowbrook Estates. I invited her in and offered her coffee, which she accepted gratefully. Mr. Caldwell, I need to tell you something about Rebecca Mitchell. This isn't really about your fence or even the cattle. She and her husband have been planning something for months. Her husband? I asked, leaning forward with interest. Martha nodded. Robert Mitchell is a developer. They've been quietly trying to buy up land around here for a major expansion project. Your ranch is the key piece they need. When you wouldn't sell to their shell company last year, they decided to try other methods. I sat back, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. So the fence fine, the harassment, it's all been about forcing us to sell? Martha's hands trembled slightly as she set down her coffee cup. I have documents. Mr. Caldwell. Emails between Rebecca and Robert discussing their plans. They call it Project Greenfield. Your 40 acres would be turned into 150 luxury homes. Tyler, who'd been listening from the doorway, couldn't contain himself. They wanted to destroy our home for a bunch of houses? Martha reached into her purse and pulled out a flash drive. I've copied everything. Rebecca made the mistake of using the HOA email system for some of these communications. As board secretary, I have access to all of it. I took the flash drive, feeling its weight despite its small size. Martha, why are you telling me this? She looked at me with eyes that held both determination and sadness. Because what they're doing is wrong. I moved here to be part of a community, not to be used as a weapon against good people. And frankly, I'm tired of Rebecca's bullying tactics. She's driven out 3 families already, And enough is enough. After Martha left, I spent hours going through the emails on the flash drive. The scope of the Mitchells' plan was breathtaking in its audacity. They'd been systematically targeting every agricultural property within a 2-mile radius, using HOA fines and legal harassment to pressure families into selling. My ranch was just the largest and most stubborn holdout. One email particularly caught my attention. It was from Robert to Rebecca, dated 3 months ago. Focus on the Caldwell property. Without it, the entire project fails. Use whatever means necessary within legal bounds. Remember, everyone has a breaking point. I forwarded everything to Sarah Chen, then sat back to consider my options. The Mitchells had made a crucial error in their arrogance. They'd put their conspiracy in writing, and now I had the evidence. The next morning, I decided it was time to go on the offensive. I called Jim Turner and asked him to bring not just 30 head of cattle, but 300. Every rancher who'd offered to help got the same request. By the weekend, I wanted the largest gathering of cattle the area had seen in 50 years. Dad, isn't that a bit extreme? Tyler asked, as we prepared additional fencing to handle the influx. Sometimes. Son, you have to make a point that can't be ignored. The Mitchells want to destroy our way of life. I think it's time we showed them and everyone else what that way of life really means. Word spread quickly through the ranching community, and what started as a response to HOA harassment turned into something bigger. Ranchers from 5 counties agreed to participate in what we started calling the Heritage Grazing Festival. It would be a celebration of agricultural heritage and a firm statement that ranch families wouldn't be driven off their land by developers' schemes. By Friday afternoon, cattle trucks were arriving in a steady stream. We set up temporary fencing to manage the herds, creating a massive grazing area that stretched along the entire border between our ranch and Willowbrook estates. The sight of hundreds of cattle moving across the landscape was something out of the Old West, and even I was awed by the response. Rebecca's reaction was predictable and immediate. She arrived with Robert in tow, both of them looking like they were about to have matching strokes. Her white outfit of the day was already wilting in the heat, and Robert's expensive suit was thoroughly out of place among the cowboys and ranchers who'd gathered to help. "This is insane," Robert shouted over the lowing of cattle. "You can't do this. We'll sue you into bankruptcy." Sarah Chen stepped forward, having arrived earlier to ensure everything was legally sound. "Actually, Mr. Mitchell, every animal here is covered by the agricultural easements. Every rancher has filed the proper movement permits. And thanks to your wife's assertion of HOA jurisdiction over the Caldwell Ranch, she's actually validated the interconnected nature of these properties under agricultural law." Robert's face went through several shades of red before settling on an alarming purple. "You don't know who you're dealing with. I have connections at the state level. I'll have every one of these animals removed by tomorrow." "I don't think so," said a new voice. Everyone turned to see Judge Patricia Hawkins walking up, dressed in jeans and boots instead of her usual robes. "As it happens, I've been asked to review the legal framework here, and Mr. Caldwell appears to be entirely within his rights." I tried to hide my surprise. Judge Hawkins had a reputation for fairness, but I hadn't expected her to show up personally. She looked at the Mitchells with barely concealed disgust. "I've also been made aware of certain emails discussing a coordinated effort to force agricultural families off their land. That's something the judicial system takes very seriously." Rebecca grabbed Robert's arm. "We should go. Call the lawyers." As they retreated to their vehicle, Judge Hawkins turned to me. "My family were ranchers too. Mr. Caldwell, what the Mitchells are trying to do is not just wrong, it's a threat to our entire way of life. You have more support than you know." The Heritage Grazing Festival, as we'd started calling it, took on a life of its own. By Saturday morning, it wasn't just cattle and ranchers. Families from across the county arrived to show support. Local vendors set up booths, selling everything from barbecue to handmade crafts. A bluegrass band started playing on a makeshift stage. What had begun as a protest had transformed into a celebration of rural heritage. Tyler was in his element, giving tours to city kids who'd never seen a cow up close. I watched him explaining the basics of cattle care to a group of fascinated children from Willowbrook Estates, whose parents had brought them over despite Rebecca's dire warnings about safety. "Mr. Caldwell," one mother said to me, her young daughter on her shoulders to better see the cattle. "We had no idea about the Mitchells' plans. Most of us just wanted a nice place to raise our families. We don't want to drive out the ranchers who were here first." More and more Willowbrook residents echoed similar sentiments as the day went on. The tide was turning against the Mitchells, and they knew it. I saw them several times throughout the day, watching from their property with binoculars and making frequent phone calls. The climax came on Sunday afternoon. A convoy of black SUVs arrived, and out stepped a team of lawyers in suits that looked absurdly out of place among the cowboys and families. They marched toward me with briefcases in hand, clearly intending to serve some kind of legal papers, but before they could reach me, something remarkable happened. The ranchers and community members formed a protective circle, linking arms in peaceful resistance. Judge Hawkins stepped forward to meet the lawyers, and I heard her say clearly, "Gentlemen, I hope you have proper authorization to disrupt a peaceful assembly on agricultural land." The lead lawyer faltered, clearly not expecting to face a judge. "We have cease and desist orders for Mr. Caldwell regarding the unauthorized assembly of livestock." Judge Hawkins took the papers and examined them carefully. "These orders are based on false premises and were obtained without proper disclosure of the existing agricultural easements. I'd be very careful about proceeding with any action based on fraudulent claims." As the lawyers huddled to confer, a murmur went through the crowd. Someone had pulled up the emails Martha Williams had provided, displaying them on the large screen we'd set up for the band. The crowd fell silent as they read Robert and Rebecca Mitchell's plans to systematically drive out ranch families and develop their land. The reaction was swift and decisive. Willowbrook residents who'd been on the fence turned firmly against the Mitchells. Several board members announced their resignations on the spot. By the time the sun began to set, Rebecca Mitchell had lost not just her war against my ranch, but her position in the community she'd tried to rule. The lawyers retreated without serving their papers. The Mitchells were nowhere to be seen, having apparently fled back to their house to deal with the mounting crisis. And the Heritage Grazing Festival continued with renewed energy, a celebration not just of ranching heritage, but of community solidarity against those who would destroy it. As the weekend came to a close, and ranchers began loading their cattle for the journey home, I stood with Tyler on the rise overlooking our land. The temporary fencing would come down, the vendors would pack up, and life would return to normal. But something fundamental had changed. "Dad," Tyler said, his voice thoughtful, "do you think the Mitchells will give up?" I put my arm around his shoulders. "They don't have much choice now. Son, their plans are exposed, their support is gone, and they're facing potential legal consequences for their harassment campaign. But more importantly, we've shown that our community won't be pushed around." The epilogue to our story came faster than expected. Within a month, Robert and Rebecca Mitchell had listed their house for sale and quietly left Willowbrook Estates. The HOA board was reconstituted with Martha Williams as president, and their first act was to formally recognize the agricultural heritage of the area and pledge to work cooperatively with longtime residents. Several of the ranchers who'd participated in the festival formed a heritage preservation society, ensuring that the stories and traditions of ranch life would be passed on to future generations. Tyler became actively involved, using his experience during the conflict to bridge the gap between old-timers and newcomers. As for the $10,000 fine that started it all, it was formally withdrawn with an apology from the new HOA board. They even paid our legal fees and contributed to the Heritage Preservation Fund as a gesture of goodwill. 6 months later, I was repairing the same fence that had sparked the conflict when a familiar car pulled up, but instead of Rebecca Mitchell, out stepped Martha Williams with a plate of cookies and a warm smile. "Mr. Caldwell, I wanted to thank you again for standing up to the Mitchells. Willowbrook Estates is a better place now that we're working with our neighbors instead of against them." I accepted the cookies gratefully and offered her a tour of the ranch. As we walked, she shared stories of other HOAs that had learned from our conflict, reforming their policies to respect agricultural heritage and longtime residents. That evening, as Tyler and I sat on the porch watching the sunset, he asked, Dad, do you think there are other families out there dealing with people like the Mitchells? I nodded slowly. Unfortunately, son, there probably are, but maybe our story will help them realize they don't have to face it alone. Sometimes, standing up for what's right means standing together. The cattle were gone now, returned to their home ranches. But the impact of their presence remained. Willowbrook Estates had learned to coexist with its agricultural neighbors. Children from the subdivision regularly visited for educational tours. And the Heritage Grazing Festival had become an annual event that celebrated the best of both worlds. Rebecca Mitchell had tried to use her HOA position to destroy our way of life. But instead, she'd helped unite a community and strengthen the very heritage she'd sought to eliminate. It was a reminder that sometimes the best response to a bully isn't just to fight back, but to transform the battlefield entirely. As darkness fell over the ranch that had been in our family for over a century, I felt a deep satisfaction. The fence that had started it all still stood, still 3 inches taller than Rebecca Mitchell had deemed acceptable, but now it represented something more than a property line. It was a symbol of resistance, community, and the enduring power of heritage over harassment. Tyler headed inside to do his homework. But I lingered on the porch, thinking about my grandfather and what he would have made of our modern-day range war. I think he would have been proud that we'd found a way to honor the old ways while building bridges to the new. And he definitely would have enjoyed watching those 300 cattle grazing within sight of Rebecca Mitchell's pristine white mansion. The Caldwell Ranch would continue, as it had for generations, adapting to new challenges while holding firm to its roots. And if another HOA president ever tried to fine us for our fence posts, well, we'd already proven that some battles are best won, not with lawyers and fines, but with cattle, community, and the courage to stand your ground. The stars came out over the Texas prairie, same as they had for centuries, indifferent to HOAs and development plans. And underneath them, our ranch continued its quiet existence, a testament to the power of persistence and the folly of those who mistake tradition for weakness. Rebecca Mitchell had learned that lesson the hard way, and in the end, her attempted conquest had only made us stronger. 1 year later, almost to the day Rebecca Mitchell had first shown up with her clipboard and threats, I received an unexpected letter. The return address made me pause before opening it. Austin, Texas. From Rebecca Mitchell herself. Tyler was in the kitchen making breakfast when I sat down to read it. Dear Mr. Caldwell. The letter began in neat, careful handwriting. I have spent the past year reflecting on my actions and the harm I caused to you, your family, and our community. There are no excuses for my behavior, only explanations that now seem hollow even to me. I was angry at my life, displaced by divorce, and desperate to control something, anything. Your ranch became the target of that misplaced anger. I set the letter down and looked out the window at the fence that had started it all. Tyler noticed my expression and came over. What's wrong? Dad? It's from Rebecca Mitchell, I said, handing him the letter to read. His eyes widened as he continued reading aloud. I am writing to formally apologize and to inform you that my ex-husband and I have agreed to create a fund for agricultural heritage preservation. We are donating $1 million to ensure that families like yours can continue their traditions without harassment from people like I used to be. I hope someday you can forgive me. Tyler sat down heavily. Wow, do you think she means it? I thought about the woman who had stood in her pristine white outfit, sneering at our way of life, and compared that to the humility in this letter. People can change. Son, sometimes it takes losing everything to find out who you really are. The Agricultural Heritage Fund became a reality 2 months later, with Martha Williams and Judge Hawkins serving on the board alongside several longtime ranchers. The fund helped 17 families fight off aggressive development attempts in its first year alone. Rebecca never returned to the area, but her donation created a lasting positive impact that helped heal some of the wounds she'd caused. The second annual Heritage Grazing Festival was even bigger than the first. This time, it was officially sponsored by both the agricultural community and Willowbrook Estates, which had become a model for rural-suburban cooperation. Television crews from Dallas and Houston covered the event, spreading our story across Texas. Tyler had taken on the role of youth coordinator, organizing educational programs that brought together ranch kids and subdivision children. Watching him confidently lead a group of teenagers through basic horsemanship skills, I felt a pride deeper than any successful cattle drive or business deal. Mr. Caldwell called Emma Chen, a teenager from Willowbrook whose parents had moved from California. Thank you for fighting for this. My parents thought they were moving to just another suburb, but now they understand they're part of something special, something with history. That evening, as the festival wound down, Judge Hawkins approached me with an interesting proposition. Mason, have you thought about writing down this story? What happened here could help other communities facing similar conflicts. I laughed, gesturing at my calloused hands. Judge, I'm a rancher, not a writer. She smiled knowingly. Maybe not, but your son seems to have inherited both your backbone and his mother's way with words. Tyler had been accepted to the University of Texas journalism program, with plans to document agricultural heritage stories across the state. As we cleaned up after the festival, I found myself standing at the spot where Rebecca had first confronted me about those fence posts. The fence still stood, still 3 inches too tall by her old standards, but now decorated with ribbons and children's artwork from the festival. Sarah Chen joined me, carrying a box of leftover programs. You know, Mason, what you did here changed more than just one HOA. I've been getting calls from ranchers in 5 states asking for help with similar situations. The Caldwell defense. They're calling it. I shook my head, embarrassed by the attention. We just stood up for what was right. No, Sarah corrected. You showed people how to stand up effectively. There's a difference between fighting and winning, and you taught a masterclass in winning. I stopped and looked back at our land, bathed in moonlight. Then we'd have lost more than $10,000. Son, we'd have lost our right to exist on our own terms. Some fights are worth having. Even when they seem impossible to win, the stars were bright overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a cow lowed softly. The sound that had once driven Rebecca Mitchell to rage now seemed like a peaceful reminder that some things endure despite all attempts to change them. Our ranch, our heritage, and our community had not just survived, but thrived. Proof that standing your ground can sometimes change the ground itself.